Scripture reading will be from Romans chapter 13, verses 1 and 2. Romans chapter 13, verses 1 and 2. Let every soul be subject to the governing authorities, for there is no authority except from God, and the authorities that exist are appointed by God. Therefore, whoever resists authority resists the ordinance of God, and those who resist will bring judgment on themselves.
Good morning. Everybody get your Bibles and be at Romans chapter 13. Many of you are already there, but go ahead and get out your Bible if you haven't got it out yet and turn to Romans chapter 13. What are we going to be doing in just a couple of days, class? That's right, Thanksgiving. That's exactly right. We're going to enjoy Thanksgiving in a few days, and we've got a lot to be thankful for, do we not? What about the country that we live in? Oh, are you thankful for America? I'm thankful for this country. And because we are living in the greatest country in the world with so many blessings and benefits, one of those blessings and benefits that we're so thankful for is the right to vote. And we get to vote in just a couple of Tuesday, November the 8th. We're going to go to the polls, and we are going to vote. The Christian and Government. And I put up here a copy of the ballot that we're going to be looking at when we go into the polls. You know, a lot of people look at government, and we wonder about that. That's a spooky word. But we in America, we're so thankful because we have gotten in our Constitution the right to vote. It's in Article 1, Section number 4 of the Constitution, alludes to the fact that there are going to be elections. You know, a lot of governments don't have that privilege. You know, the term government, the word government, this is what govern means. To control, direct, or strongly influence the actions and conduct of something. So, if I govern a mule, then I am strongly influencing the actions of that mule. If I govern a ship, I might be the governor of a ship, then I am influencing the actions and the behavior of that particular vessel. Or if I'm governing a nation, then I am certainly influencing the actions and the conduct of that nation. Now, there's been many forms of government. You can look it up on the internet. There's a list this long. You know, there is such a thing as anarchy. Anarchy means no government. People who like anarchy, they're anarchists. They just don't want any government at all. Well, you know what happens to a country that has no control, no influence of a society. And then there's the aristocracy. An aristocracy is one that is ruled by the rich people. They're aristocrats. They take care of all the rules and all the influence of the whole nation. Well, we're not living under aristocracy. There is a bureaucracy. A bureaucracy is a government that's controlling a nation by departments. You know, this bureau of a particular thing, this bureau, that bureau, that's a bureaucracy. And it's governing the folks through bureaus or departments. And then there's communism. We've heard that word a lot, and that is where the government controls and influences everything through the state. And it's commonly owned, but it's all dictated through the state. There's socialism, a little bit different. It's governed that everybody owns socially, but it's distributed and affected by the people, by the society. That's socialism. They're very, very close. Then there's a dictatorship. You know about a dictatorship. This is where the influence of a nation is controlled by one person with absolute power. That's a dictatorship. I'm so glad we don't live under a dictatorship here in America, where one person tells me and you and all of us what he wants us to do. We're not under a dictatorship. We're not under a king. A king is a monarchy, where mono means one, so it's a government through one, and usually through a family. He gets the power because he was born into it. He's the highest, the oldest guy, and he gets to be the next king. That's a monarchy. And of course, we are a democracy. Now, the United States of America is the oldest democracy in the world. We invented it. Our forefathers come up with the idea. We said we don't want to be under a king, King George. We don't want to be under him. We don't want to be under a monarchy. We want to come up with our own form. Well, you want a dictatorship? No. Do you want an aristocracy where the rich people? No, we don't want that either. What about socialism? No, we don't want that. We don't want communism. What do we want? We want a government that is for the people, but by the people. And so they created a democracy. Now, we are not the only democracy in the world now. As a matter of fact, we're smaller than some democracies. The largest democracy is India. Now, they don't look like we look as far as the way we're set up as our democracy, but they're still a democracy, the largest one in the world, India. We're the oldest, they're the largest. What we really are is a democratic republic. We're a democratic republic, which simply means that we elect representatives that go out and make our legislation a law. A democracy, a pure democracy, is every law that we live under, everybody votes for it and the majority rules. The people rule. That ain't the way we work. We roll by getting people in place so that they can go up there and represent us. And so we send our representatives up there into the places that be to make our legislation for us. What a blessing it is to have this democratic republic so that we can go to the polls on Tuesday and choose representatives that we believe will represent our interest and go up there and make those laws for us. But a lot of people don't want to be bothered with that. They don't want to get involved. They said, I want to be involved in politics. Politics really is the art or the science of government. It's how to govern. Democracy is the type of government, but politics is how to do it and when to do it and how to keep it when you got it. If I've got the power, I want to keep the power, right? So that's what politics is. And so because of politics that get involved in all sorts of governments, there's politics in dictatorships, there's politics in monarchies, there's politics in democracies, the politics in all the types of government has politics which deal with how we're going to do all this government stuff. So because of politics, we get turned off. We don't appreciate our democracy because of some of the politicians maybe that get involved in the art of government. And so it turns us off. So we think, well, we don't want to be involved in any of that. It's all corrupt anyway. I see on the TV corrupt politicians everywhere. And so we just don't want to be involved. And maybe they say something like this. They say, well, we really don't believe that the policies that our politicians put out in our democracy affects me much at all. They'll go up there and they'll make policy. Politicians makes policy. And these policies are how to make our democracy work. And we don't think that they affect us. So since it don't affect us, then I'm just going to ignore it. I don't care what they do up there. It doesn't matter. When I say up there, I'm talking about on Capitol Hill, right? And so it just doesn't matter to me who goes up there because the policies of the politicians is not going to affect this great democracy of ours. It's not going to affect me. So they choose to ignore it. And maybe they say to themselves, I have no impact. My vote's just one vote. My vote don't count. I don't need to go to the polls on Tuesday to cast my vote because it don't matter anyway. There is no impact. I can't do anything about it. These three things keep a lot of people away from Tuesday. And I'm not, you know me, if you've been here for the 10 years that Deborah and I have been here, we don't do politicians. We don't do government. We don't do things like this from the pulpit. But what I am going to share today is to teach a lesson from the Bible that tells us that these three things should not affect Christians and the government as far as how we're involved and should we ignore it and do we have an impact. So let's begin. Let's talk about being involved. Everybody turn to Romans chapter number 13. Let's begin at verse number 1. The first thing we're going to learn is that the government has power. I don't care if you're talking about a dictatorship, a monarchy, or democracy, or whatever. It still has the authority. It has the power. Look at verse number 1. Paul writing to the Romans, and they live in Rome now, where the Roman Empire is the central authority, right? They are in the heart of the Roman Empire. And here's what Paul says. Let every soul be subject unto the higher powers, the authorities. For there is no power but of God. Let the powers that be are ordained of God. God is the ultimate power. But if He is allowing a government to be in control, then we need to respect that. He is the one that puts that into place. Look at verse 2. Whosoever therefore resists the power, the government, resist the ordinance of God. And they that resist shall receive to themselves damnation or condemnation. Do not resist the power. Do not go against it. Do not overthrow it. Because they are representatives of God. Now, does that mean that a government is pure God? No. Does that mean that they believe in God even? No. But that does mean that God has got them in that powerful position, that authoritative position, for a reason. And so if we go up and try to overthrow that and resist that, then we're actually resisting God's purpose for government. God has a purpose for government. The Roman Empire was not a democracy. It was an autocracy. An autocracy is one man that's in power, that's the Roman emperor, but he's guided by councils. And that is how they were set up. Not a democracy. But Paul, nonetheless, said, y'all need to obey the powers that be. A lot of those Christians were saying, we're in the kingdom of God. We're Christians. We don't have to answer to any higher power other than God Himself. Paul is making a clarification. This Roman government, this autocracy that I've got in place is in place for a reason. So you need not to resist the power. In fact, if they do something that is outside of God's power, then we're not obligated to obey that. We know that in Acts chapter number 5 and verse 28 and 29. You remember that Peter and John were arrested for preaching Jesus. They were whipped and they were told, don't you preach Jesus. And they went out, and what did they do, class? They preached Jesus anyway. It was a direct going against the law. They broke the law. Don't do it, they did it. Why? Because they directed them to do something that was outside of God's power. And so when they were re-arrested and brought, did we not tell you not to go off and preach Jesus? And here's what they said. We ought to obey God rather than what, class? Men. We obey God rather than men. So if our democracy or our dictatorship or monocracy or communism or socialism or whatever form of government we under, if they try to tell us that we've got to do something that goes directly against the will of God, the power of God, we're not obligated to serve that. But when they are there for God's purpose, then we are to submit. Look at verse number 4. Here's the reason. Rulers are not a terror to good works, but to the evil. That's the reason God's got governments in power, to maintain order. If you're a good person and you're obeying the law, they're not a terror to you. Only to the people who are evil. Wilt thou therefore not be afraid of the power? If you do something wrong against the law, then you ought to be afraid of them. Here's what you ought to do. Do that which is good. Just do the right thing. As you serve under whatever government that you're under, that God ordained, then you just do the right thing. It'll be okay. The purpose of that government will serve God's purpose. thou shalt have praise of the same. The government will praise you. The government will reward you. In verse number 4, for, here's the reason, he, the government, is the minister of God to thee for good. That's the reason God put a government there, for your good. But if thou do that which is evil, if you break the law, then you ought to be afraid. Certainly be afraid. Why? For he, the government, beareth not the sword in vain. There's a reason that he's got a pistol. There's a reason that he's got a taser. There's a reason he's got the sword, the authority, the jailhouses, whatever it be. But if thou do that which is evil, be afraid, for he beareth not the sword in vain, for he is a minister of God. God put this government in place to keep the peace and to punish evildoers. He's a revenger to execute upon him that does evil. That's the purpose of your government. Do they believe in God? Doesn't matter. Are you going to elect somebody, a representative that believes exactly what you believe about the Bible? Doesn't matter. If he represents what is going to be good for the society and good for put a condition in place, an environment in place that keeps the kingdom going, then put him up there. Let him make the laws. God will use him to keep the peace, to keep the order. Paul himself used the government. In Acts chapter number 23, Paul was in jail. He had been arrested, not for breaking the law of God, but he certainly upset the apple cart in this autocracy of the Roman Empire, and he got thrown in jail. Well, what happened? Found out that there were some people that were going to assassinate him, a conspiracy to have him killed. What did he do? He called for the chief captain of the government, and he said, help me. And the chief captain helped him. Moved him out of Dodge, moved him out of Jerusalem, put him over to Caesarea in the middle of the night under a large army to get him out of there safely. Now, Lysias, the chief captain, wasn't necessarily a Christian. He wasn't necessarily even a believer in the one true God, but he was put there by God for a purpose. What? To protect Paul and others. In Judges, chapter number 17, verse number 6, here's what the Bible says. In those days there was no king in Israel. There was no authority. There was no government. It was anarchy. In those days there was anarchy. But every man did that which was right in his own eyes. And when you have that situation with no government, then there's no peace. And there's all sorts of bad things that go on. The government is in place for the peace and the order of the society. Wherefore, look at verse number 5. You must, what? You must needs be subject. Not only for wrath, not because you're scared of the gun, not because you're scared of the jailhouse, but do it for conscience sake. It's the right thing to do. Since God ordains the governments for the benefit of us, then we ought to respect them and do the right thing. This means that we're to provide for the government. They can't operate without money. They can't operate without resources. That's why Paul wrote in verse 6 of Romans 13, for this cause pay ye tribute. That's taxes. Pay taxes also. Why? For they, the government, are God's ministers, attending continually upon this very thing, to keep you at peace, to keep things in order. Don't defund the police. Don't do that. Fund them. Why? Because they're there for the very reason that God put them there, to maintain peace. Render, verse number 7, therefore to all their dues, tribute to whom tribute is due, custom to whom custom is due, fear to whom fear is due, honor to whom honor is due. So that's the way that a Christian should approach his government. Even Jesus paid taxes. In Matthew chapter number 17, he told Peter, me and you, go pay some taxes. In Matthew 22, he says, render therefore unto Caesar the things that are Caesar's, render unto God the things that are God's. So they are in place for a purpose, and we should provide for their authority. We should provide for them whatever they need to keep us safe. But pray for them. Whatever we do, pray for them. In 1 Timothy chapter number 2, verse number 1 beginning, he said, I exhort thee, Paul writing to Timothy, that first of all, supplication, prayers, intercession, giving of thanks be made for all men. But in verse 2 he says, for kings and for all that are in authority. Pray for those folks. Why? That we may lead a quiet and peaceful life. That's the purpose of government, is to maintain the order, maintain peace, for people not to be killed in the middle of the night in their homes. That's the purpose of our government, to protect and serve the folks. Now, there's a lot of things the government gets involved in, maybe outside their purview, but they do get involved in it. Nonetheless, their primary purpose for God is that we may live a quiet and peaceful life in godliness and honesty. So send people up there that will provide that for us. And persuade our government. When we do send people up there, we can write them a letter. We can persuade them to do certain things and vote certain ways. Being under an autocracy at the Roman government level, Paul was in prison, and there he was right in front of Agrippa, and Agrippa was just hounding him and questioning him, and Paul was addressing him. And what was he doing? Paul was persuading Agrippa about Christianity, about godly things. Now Agrippa, he knew about the Jews, he knew about the Christ, he knew about these things, but he was an autocracy type of government. And Paul said to Agrippa, I want you to be a Christian. And Agrippa said, almost thou persuadest me to be a Christian. You almost did that. So we should be persuading our government to do Christ-like things. We need to be involved. And our vote is one way to do that. God himself is involved in government. In Psalms 82, verse number 8, here's what David asked God. Arise, O God, judge the earth, for thou shalt inherit all nations. That means you're going to lead the nations. Judge the earth, lead the nations. Take care of the people over in China. Take care of that government. Take care of this government. Take care of our government. Take care of the governments of the world. Why? Because we need to live a quiet and peaceful life in all godliness. So David asked God to get involved. If God's going to get involved, shouldn't his people be involved? In Daniel chapter 4, verse 25, when Nebuchadnezzar was kicked off the throne and spent a period of time out in the field, mentally ill, and he finally got well, and he got back on the throne of Babylon, here's what he said. He said, I now understand that God, he's the Most High. This is in Daniel chapter 4, verse 25. The Most High ruleth in the kingdom of men and gives it to whomever he will. I now get it. God's on his throne. And we need to understand that he's involved. So pray for these people, persuade these people, provide for these people, and respect these people's power. Don't ignore it. Don't say that it does not apply to me, because it does. The policies won't affect me, because it does. Sometimes directly, sometimes indirectly. In Esther, chapter number 4, read it for yourself, the whole story. But you remember Mordecai, when the policies of the Persian government said we're going to kill all the Jews on a certain day. It's going to happen. Well, Esther was the queen. Nobody knew she was a Jew except Mordecai, her family member. The king himself, Xerxes, the king of the Persians. He didn't know his wife, the queen, was Jewish. And he passed this horrible law. We're going to kill all the Jews. Complete annihilation of the Jews. Genocide. It's going to happen. That's my policy. That's what we're going to do. And Mordecai called Esther out and said, you better not ignore that. You better not think that you're going to get away from that. He says, think not. This is Esther chapter 4, verse 13. Think not with yourself that you will escape the king's house more than all the other Jews. It's going to affect you. What the king's policies in that type of government, it's going to affect you, Esther. So certainly you need to get involved. And you don't need to ignore it. It's coming home to roost, as it were. Mordecai told Esther Do not hold your peace. Do not keep it to yourself, Esther, because you are going to be affected by the policies. And that's certainly true of a democracy like the United States of America. Whatever policies are going on up there is going to affect us. You say, well, it really doesn't. Let's say that you're unique and for some reason it doesn't affect you. And you think in your mind, well, it doesn't. All these laws that are coming down, they really don't affect me. You don't have to buy gas. You don't have to do all this other stuff. You don't have to pay for food. If for some reason it really doesn't affect you, should you ignore it then? And the answer is a resounding no. Why? Because it's going to affect your neighbor. And what does the Bible say about your neighbor? Love your neighbor. Care about your neighbor. You can actually use your vote as stewardship. I may not be affected by those policies, but my neighbor is. The guy up the street is. That guy lost his job. That guy needs a job. That guy's going to be affected by a positive policy or a negative policy or whatever. For the sake of my neighbors, for the sake of people in another state, I don't even know them, but for the sake of them, I'm going to go to vote, and I'm going to send somebody up there that'll help my neighbor. So at least look at it from that point of view. Because in Luke chapter 12, verse 48, the Bible says, Jesus says, "For unto whomsoever much is given, of him shall much be required." We have been given the blessing of being able to vote for our own representatives. We don't have to listen to a dictator or a monarch or an aristocrat. We don't have to do that. Or the state under communism. We don't have to do that. We get to choose our representatives. And since we have that blessing, then whoever much is given, then much is required. We have the responsibility. You say, well, it don't matter. There's no impact. My vote don't count. Yes, it does. Very much so. In Ezekiel chapter number 22, Ezekiel's in Babylonian captivity, and he says, oh me, we're in this Babylonian captivity. Why are we down here? What happened? How come God let us get captured? Well, read chapter 22 for yourself. And Ezekiel said, here's the reason we're down here. Your priest went rotten. Your prophets went rotten. Your princes went rotten. The people went rotten. And here's what God said. I sought for a man, one person, among all these folks, that they should make up the hedge and stand in the gap before me and the land, that I should not destroy it. All these people went rotten in the government, in the communities, in all these places. And I was just looking for one person to make an impact. Just one. I found none. And so, that's the reason you're down here in Babylonian captivity. If we do not stand up, even if we're just one, we can make an impact. But if we don't do that, no wonder things are going rotten. We're not speaking up. We're not making an impact ourselves. In Jeremiah chapter number 5, somebody brought this to my attention just the other day on a written sheet. I love this concept. But in Jeremiah chapter number 5, verse number 1, God told Jeremiah, run ye to and fro through the streets of Jerusalem. Run up and down that street. Run down that street. And see now and know something. What? Seek in the broad places. If you can find a man, just find one. If there be any that executes justice and seeks truth, just go out there and find one. And if you'll do that, Jeremiah, go up and down the streets, go everywhere. And if you'll find just one person, I will pardon the folks. I'll forgive them. Jeremiah found none. And God destroyed them. One person will make an impact. This coming Friday, November the 11th, is Veterans Day. We're going to honor those people who fought for our freedom. Can we not at least vote for our freedom? I think so. In a godly way. They may not be a Christian. Wish they were. Persuade them to be one. But send the folks that you think. I'm not telling you how to vote. I'm not going to let you tell me how to vote. We can talk about it. Help me to understand. I'll help you to understand all these things, my point of view. But here's the point. Send somebody up there that'll help us live a quiet and peaceful life. But here's something far, far more important than even our democracy in the United States of America that we live under. We need to be involved. There's so many people that don't want to get involved. I don't want to get involved in church. I don't want to be a part of this God stuff, this Bible stuff, this Jesus stuff. Folks, you're already involved. You're already involved. How so? Because you've made a choice not to be involved. Therefore, you are a non-involver. And one of these days, when Jesus comes back, there is a heaven, there is a hell. Whether you wanted to get involved in church or not, you're still going to be in front of that. You're still going to be affected by that. We need to be involved. And don't ignore it and say, well, there's nothing that I can do. There's nothing that will make a difference in my life. So I'm just going to ignore all this God stuff. Do not ignore it, because it will affect you. It'll affect you whether you believe it affects you or not. And certainly don't say that I can't make a difference. Even if I become a Christian, I can't make a difference. Yes, you can. One person is all God was looking for, to make a difference in the lives of many. There's one person that God sent to make a difference in your life, and that is His only begotten Son, Jesus Christ. One man sent to this earth to suffer, bleed, and die so that I can go to heaven, so that you can go to heaven, so that the world can be saved if they will get involved, if they will not ignore it, if they'll not think it don't affect me. Because it does. Folks, if you're here today and you need to be involved, please don't ignore it. You can make a difference. Jesus did. Why don't you come while together we stand and sing?